Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar presented by LA Thrives. My name is Alan Greenlee. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. I'm going to share my screen with you right now so I walk through a few opening slides for today's event. As I mentioned, this is a LA Thrives event and part of a three-part arc, a series of webinars that we've put on since about June, really focusing on equity and the recovery from the COVID pandemic. Today's presentation is very exciting and we're looking forward to it, so let's get to it. As I mentioned, this is part of an extension of work that LA Thrives has been working on for a number of years. Our organization has put together a series of roundtables that happen on about a quarterly basis that really look at the intersection of the major transit build out that's happening in the county, the question of equity and housing in particular, but the question of equity more broadly stated as a function of that transit build out. How do we ensure that low income people benefit from this new transit infrastructure that we're building? We've been meeting on a quarterly basis, but since March, I've been looking at this three-part arc of a series of webinars, and today is the third of those events. Just as a reminder, back in May, towards the end of May, we had a session that looked at the federal interventions that could contribute to an equitable recovery. And then in June, we took what we learned in May and coupled that with a look at some of the state resources that were being made available and some of the folks that were working on a state level recovery. And today we're going to look at a really exciting report that was just released that talks about what equitable recovery looks like here in LA. I want to take a moment to recognize the steering committee of LA Thrives, Alfredo Gonzalez from the Resources Legacy Fund, Ben Winter at the California Community Foundation, Ari Kimamayama from the Low Income Investment Fund, bear with me for a second. I've lost my screen here. I'm back. Let's see, we're Tori Kier from the Los Angeles Neighborhood Housing Land Trust, Johanna Cabot from the Liberty Hill Foundation, Shashi Hanuman from Public Counsel, and Manal Abueleta from the Prevention Institute. Today's session is really about a report that was just recently released, talking about equity and recovery. And you'll see this terrific quote from the LA Times editorial board as they reviewed the report. And I think it sort of sums up what's encapsulated in that report in a very great way. Today's speakers are Professor Manuel Pastor, the director of the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California, Jacqueline Wagner, the newly minted president of Solutions for Enterprise Community Partners. Congratulations, Jacqueline, on that new role. We're all really excited for you and proud to have LA represented at a national level in that really important job at Enterprise. And then finally, there's a session agenda here. We're going to transition fairly quickly here to some background on the report and then remarks from Jacqueline and Professor Pastor. And then as a matter of how to handle the questions and answers, looking forward to questions from the group. We have a few prepared answers, but quite frankly, I'm sure there's a bunch of smart great questions that'll come up from the dialogue. Would invite you to send through the Q&A section down there in the Zoom box your questions, and I'll be looking through those a little bit and curating some of the ones that I think are most provocative. So we'll be acting as the voice of God to present these questions for Professor Pastor and Jacqueline. And with that, I'm going to transition and invite Professor Manuel Pastor to talk a little bit about the report and start off our conversation.
Great, good to be with you. Let me just make sure this slideshow gets up and going. Great, and Alan, can you nod if you're looking at a slide? Perfect. Okay, well, I'm super excited to be with you today presenting this, and I'm particularly excited to be presenting it with Jacqueline, because I, of course, am a professor of problems, and now she is a president of solutions. So I'm thinking that together we might actually be able to do something meaningful both with this report and with our work in the world. Let me say a couple of things that motivated this report, provide a little bit of context, and really set up Jacqueline to talk about some of the solutions that are actually proposed in the report. First, it's important to realize that part of what motivated this report were two really critical things. One was a recognition that COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses. So while it's a pandemic, it really illustrated employment precarity, the racial wealth gap, differences in terms of access to healthcare, issues with regard to mental stress and mental health, issues with regard to incarceration, congregate communities, and COVID risk, and actually a lot of issues with regard to legal status here in Southern California and how that affected people's ability to weather this crisis. So COVID is the disease that revealed our illness. Second, very, very important, we actually began this with a framework that we were going to lay out a roadmap to recovery. But as we began to study the situation, what we realized was we didn't want to recover. We didn't want to go back to a normal that actually did not work for most people, that reflected tremendous racial inequality, that tremendous income inequality, and that what we needed to do was to craft a vision to go to a place we had never been before, an equitable and inclusive Los Angeles. The third thing we realized is this was going to take a lot of people. So we crafted a very unusual collaboration between USC and UCLA. You're all, pretty much all of you listening to this from Los Angeles. You know that for USC and UCLA to get together on something, it must be a gigantic problem, and it must be a sort of signal of the possibility of bringing peace to the Mideast if you could get USC and UCLA to work together. But our Equity Research Institute, working with the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and actually also working with a very exciting and newly formed Committee for Greater LA, which was brought together and included Fred Ali from the Weingart Foundation, Raul Anaya from the Bank of America, several people that you can see from the county supervisor offices, Matt Szabo from America City's office, but also some community-based organizations like LA Brotherhood Crusade, Khmer Girls in Action, LA County Schools, LASA, the LA Council President Martinez, Jacqueline Wagner, folks from labor like April Verrett, folks in the immigrant community like Cynthia Buisa. And it is a committee that actually wound up meeting, and thank you, Jacqueline, for doing this, probably about 20 times. of a knowledge community was actually a very important part of being able to come to some agreement about the analysis and what to do. And actually, it's a very important part of what LA Thrives has done over the years, is create a knowledge community by bringing together people from somewhat unsuspected collaborations. There were a couple of lead authors and researchers, myself and Gary Segura, but as you can see from all of the contributing authors, there's a reason why we say God invented graduate students, because graduate students and fellow researchers and fellow committee members were an important part of contributing to the base of knowledge. And of course, there was a broad group of funders that came together. So what were some of the fundamental findings of the report, and thinking about the principles and handing it off to Jacqueline to talk about policies? First, when we hear about COVID, and this is actually the most recent data as of about a day ago, we tend to think about COVID as something that, of course, can affect all of us. There's now more than 275,000 cases that have occurred in LA County, 6,500 going to 6,600 deaths. And of course, any one of us is at risk for getting this. But one of the really important things, if you look at the data, is that while all of us are at risk, COVID is definitively not an equal opportunity offender. This is looking at the cumulative cases by race and ethnicity in California from April 13th to, again, a couple of days ago. Why mid-April rather than mid-March? Really, a lot of the data collection really didn't get fully in place until mid-April, and a lot of our data on race has gotten better as time has gone along. But as you can see here, really when COVID first hit, it was something that was really affecting whiter, wealthier communities, because they tended to be the communities that were either more engaged in international travel or more engaged in the kind of professional interactions that brought them in contact with international travelers. And so you saw pretty high cases initially, Malibu, Santa Monica, at Bel Air, etc. But as you can see, for California, as the time has gone on, the share of cases reported in white communities has gone down dramatically. The share reported in Latino communities has gone up dramatically from about 36% in mid-April to fully 61% of the cases coming in Latino communities. And these disparities get to be very sharp when you look locally. So for example, in Monterey County, two equivalent populations, East Salinas, which has about 25% of the county's cases, and then Pacific Groves, Carmel, Monterey, which has a similar population, but only 2% of the cases. And disparities, for example, here in LA as well, with seeing very big distinctions, for example, between two cities that have about the same population. Bell, which is a southeast city, and Manhattan Beach. Bell has 4 times the cases as Manhattan Beach. This is also reflected in the death data. This is the age-adjusted death data, controlling for the age of the population. And what you can see here is that the death data is much higher for Black Angelenos. It's about 3 times higher than it is for whites amongst Latino Angelenos, and almost 4 times higher for Pacific Islanders. What explains this? For African Americans, a lot of it is caseload, but a lot of it is comorbidities that are things like diabetes, obesity, and hypertension. When I presented this in the past, people will say, well, those comorbidities, that's really what explains it, not the differential but by race. But if you think about it, maybe for about 5 seconds, those comorbidities are actually the result of structural racism, food deserts, which create things like obesity and diabetes, or the lack of parks and lack of places for people to exercise in Black communities, or the stress of being Black in America, which contributes to hypertension. For Latinos and Pacific Islanders, you're going to see that it has a lot to do, as it does with African Americans, with their exposures at work, and also with living in multi-family households where there's a lot higher risk. So there's a bigger COVID risk in these populations of color, exacerbated around issues of death. And there's also a big economic risk as well. This is looking at the most recent data. Actually, Jacqueline, both that last data and this is even more recent than was in the report because we designed the data so we could continually update it. Yay, us, we are smart. So this is looking at the EDD data reporting on who used either unemployment insurance, regular UI, or PUA, pandemic unemployment assistance, the extra $600 a week. The reason why that's important is because if you were like a gig worker or got your hours reduced, you were eligible for PUA. And so that was a better measure of economic distress than just looking at the regular UI, which required job loss and then also looking for a job when there are no jobs. What you'll notice here is that this recession from COVID actually affects women more than men. And that's a big distinction from the recession of 2008, 2009, which hit construction and manufacturing very hard. This is one that's hitting restaurants, hospitality, retail, service work, affecting women more. It's really hitting young workers. And the reason why that's important is because number one, they're disproportionately people of color. Number two, it winds up having a permanent impact on their wage and earnings trajectory later in life. From a lot of research that UCLA economist Tilman Wachter has shown us. So it's not just a short-term hit, it's a long-term hit. And you'll see that the unemployment experience for Black Californians has been much sharper than for every other group. You may wonder why the Latino unemployment experience has not been as high. The reason, as you'll see in a minute, is that a lot of Latino workers are undocumented and have not been able to apply for unemployment insurance or PUA, so it's not being reported in this particular set of statistics. What has been happening in terms of risk? Well, this looks at LA County workers by ethnicity and nativity, and whether or not they're in essential, higher risk jobs. Essential means grocery store clerk, truck driver, healthcare worker, meat packer, agricultural worker. Higher risk means that you work near a lot of people, and so you get a thing that's called an O-net physical proximity score that's high. Non-essential lower risk means your job isn't really that necessary and you can work apart from other people. This is remote work. So for example, if you're the manager of hedge funds, you might think you're pretty important, but you're not actually essential to anyone and you don't wind up getting a lot of risk. But if you look at this, the essential higher risk workers are Black, Latino, both US born and immigrant, and in particular, immigrant Pacific Islanders. Go back to those cases that we were looking at before. But you can also see non-essential higher risk means your job probably got rolled back because it wasn't essential. That's retail, hospitality, restaurants, because you had a lot of contact with people and then you've suffered from the start-stop cycle of reopening, then closing. So what you can see here is that's been very high for Black workers and Latino workers in particular. And also, and for really for those groups. What that means is that Blacks and Latinos have had the worst of both worlds, both higher risk at work and more likely to be hurt by the cutbacks in employment. Why doesn't that show up in the unemployment assistance? Because a large share of Latinos are immigrants and undocumented immigrants at that. Probably about 25% of Latinos in the county are undocumented immigrants, slightly higher share for folks of working age population. Perhaps more significantly, 18% of the entire county is either undocumented themselves or living with a family member who is. And that's what people often do not think about. They tend to think about undocumented people, number one, as being recently arrived. That is no longer true. The undocumented population in the United States peaked in the year 2007, and it's been shrinking ever since, not because of Trump enforcing a border wall, but because of slowdowns in fertility rates in Mexico, which have reduced the push factors along with economic conditions there. What that means is that our undocumented immigrants are much longer lived in the United States. So currently in LA County, 70% of undocumented immigrants have been in the United States for a decade or longer. They're not undocumented immigrants, they're undocumented Angelenos, and they have formed families. And what that means is that when they are denied federal aid, you are also denying their families the assistance that they might need. And in particular, during the CARES Act, if you're a family that filed a joint return with one person with a social security number, meaning they were US born, US citizen, or legal permanent resident, and the other married, filing with an ITIN, individual taxpayer identification number, usually something undocumented folks do. That entire family unit and their children was denied the $1,200 federal relief check. So this is a large swath of Los Angeles that's been in sharp economic crisis. And when remote work and remote learning came, African Americans and Latinos were also much harder hit by being on the wrong side of the digital divide. This is a data point looking at children who were in school K through 12, who, when they went home in March, went home to a house that lacked high-speed internet and a device like a laptop or a computer, because it's not easy to do your homework on one of these. You actually do need something a little bit bigger. So who's on the wrong side of digital divide? Only about 13% of white children. At that time, 37% of black children, 39% of Latino children. Our schools have done a remarkable job trying to equip people with hotspots and Chromebooks, but they're inadequate to the task, and we've had a real season of lost learning for communities that need a lot of assistance with their learning. We also find that those children tend to live in overcrowded conditions. So this is showing these same children when they went home, the share of them that were living in households with severe overcrowding, meaning more than 1.5 people per room. Not bedroom, but room, counting living room, kitchen, etc. And you can see here that black children crowded 2.5 times at the rate of white children, Latinos about 9 times. So overcrowded households, difficult to learn, but also easy to communicate, not school lessons, but to communicate the COVID disease. Jacqueline will talk a little bit more about the housing issues, but severely rent burdened households, particularly in low-income communities like Northeast LA, Long Beach, South LA, and of course, the homelessness issue, in which about 8% of the county is African American, but about a third, according to the pre-pandemic statistics, about a third of the unsheltered population, about a third of the homeless population was Black here in the county of LA. So an issue particularly important to the Black community and very reflective of structural racism. So with all that data in mind and understanding that a lot of this was there before the pandemic struck, we really came to the conclusion that there was no going back to a normal that didn't work and left so many vulnerable to the pandemic and to systemic inequality. Critical question, there have been moments of reckoning before. The Watts Rebellion and the McCone Commission report. The LA civil unrest and Rebuild LA and so many other efforts afterwards. What's different this time? First, this is occurring in the midst of a national reckoning with racism, and we think that that allows us to think a little bit more deeply about racial inequalities in LA. Second, the crisis has created a deep understanding of the power of mutuality. We know that when we put on our masks, it is not simply to protect ourselves, but to protect other people. And we know that when this disease is allowed to ravage immigrant Latino and low-income African-American communities, that just means the disease is going to, through that working population, come to restaurants, retail places. It's going to affect all of us, and that we need to all come together and make sure that everybody's got a shot. And then finally, with no bad statements about previous infrastructure, we now have an incredibly sophisticated community and nonprofit infrastructure ready to take advantage of this moment. So we lifted up 10 principles for reinvention of Los Angeles. I'm just going to talk about 3 of them super quick and then hand things over to Jacqueline. First, address anti-Black racism in all its forms. We think that's a critical starting point principle because we understand that anti-Black racism not only affects African Americans, but it sets the terrain for the othering and marginalization of so many other populations, including immigrants. If we tackle anti-Black racism, if we make sure that Black people thrive, then we make sure that everyone thrives. We also lifted up celebrating youth leadership, empowerment, and community organizing, recognizing that it's not a report that will change things, it's communities and the work that they do. And we also really wanted to lift up the idea of metrics to hold systems accountable. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jacqueline. We also came up with a series of policy areas and recommendations, and she's going to dive deeply into 4 of them, hopefully speaking less rapidly than I was speaking very rapidly, trying to get all of this.
Well, thank you, Manuel. And before I get started, thank you for the kind notes, Dora, and Robin in the chat box, and everyone else that has reached out to me. I'm really honored to serve Enterprise on a national level, so thank you for that. And that means I'll continue serving Southern California and the state of California in this capacity. One of the things I wanted to say before we get started, you know, when I was thinking about LA Thrives, when it was first created, it was about that cross-sector engagement and collaborating around community development. And that was some of the aim of the Greater LA Steering Committee. And I think one of the most powerful things that Manuel touched on is mutuality, is how we're all connected, how all of these things intersect, and that we can't function in these silos and be successful, that we have to learn how to collaborate and think about the benefits and burdens of every single decision we make in the community development field, like how housing impacts health, and health impacts, you know, health is connected to the environment, and so on and so forth. So I will say, when I first got asked to be on the Greater LA Steering Committee, it was all about the disparities of COVID. And then George Floyd was murdered. And then the conversations got much deeper. And Manuel really, and Gary Seguro at UCLA and all the teams really took us through a really deep dialogue. I would say it was really rich in data, but it was rich in human data. We did a lot of exchange about how we are impacted here as Angelenos, and how Black people actually felt left out of some of those conversations. And it was just such a rich dialogue. It was life altering, I think, for many people at the table. And that's why we decided to keep moving forward. So I'll say that. And it's just such an honor to always work closer with Manuel, because he's always so brilliant in his delivery. But one of the things I just wanted to say is that, you know, to Manuel's point, we have a great opening right now. We're ready for a civic discourse about how we move forward together. And I've been saying, as you know, the chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness, if we fix it for Black people, we're going to fix it for everyone else. So the journey is not only about Black people, but it's about our brothers and sisters who have different mothers and fathers. So first up is Black Lives, and really in this section, we tried to capture, in order to address the disparities, you really need to tackle those for those that are impacted the most. Manuel talked about the disparity of Black people experiencing homelessness, but I want you to let sink in that Black people are 4 times more likely to become homeless. Just think about that. We're only 13% of the US population, and we make up 40% of those experiencing homelessness. That means that every other person experiencing homelessness is Black. So it's so incredibly important that we are targeted and making change here. A lot of this surfaced through Project Room Key, because we know what the data says about the unhoused, and we were really trying to have a dialogue about who's actually going into Project Room Key, who will go into Project Home Key, and how are the other systems that are meant to house people that are severely rent burdened, on the brink of homelessness, how they actually access housing. So that was a big part of the discussion. And then last but not least is that we must center our policies on racial equity. Supervisor Ridley Thomas led the charge of the anti-racist motion, which Manuel was a part of. And it happened, it was running in tandem with us. And that's also a great thing that came out of this. And if we could really absorb that, because if you look at the work of Ibram Kendi and other people, they say, if you know, if you can only be a racist or an anti-racist, and an anti-racist, you have to change policies and systems. And really, that's what we've been tackling at Enterprise. And I think a lot of people under my voice have been doing the same, including SCAMP. Next slide, please. So housing affordability, I know I have all my housers in the audience. We really wanted to put something, what we should be doing now, what should we be doing in the short term and the long term. And first and foremost, as Gary Segura would say, is stop the hemorrhaging. You know, we don't need any more people to fall into homelessness. We know that we have a large number of people that are unemployed. We have a lot of people that were severely rent burdened before COVID, and that is just a tragedy just to let them fall on our streets. It's much more expensive, and it's not humane to allow our neighbors to suffer like that. So we really want to extend eviction moratoria. And I know it's, you know, a lot of people on this phone are, you know, housing providers, and they understand that. And I want people to know that housing providers also care about their tenants, and the tenants are the priority, the buildings are second. And that is how we all move in this industry. Even though we don't amplify that, that is really how we think. Provide more rental assistance for most vulnerable tenants. That a lot of that is happening at the city and the county. And I'm excited that there's a lot of private sector partners that are looking at rental arrears to help those people that are falling into homelessness, and starting to negotiate with landlords to see if we can settle some of the debts. Because Manuel, you talked about hypertension between people of color, and really the stress of not being able to pay your debts and the stress of, you know, surviving to try to pay your rent is critical. And so we don't want people not only to be severely rent burdened, but we don't want people to be more vulnerable to COVID because of their stresses. Secondly, we need to really focus on how we're going to build more housing and preserve more housing. And so this effort is around the medium term. I know we've been echoing that for a really long time, but how could we look at adaptive reuse? I mean, Project Roomkey's case in point, and Project Homekey that the governor is pushing, is really looking at innovative ways of taking other assets and converting them to housing more rapidly. We can't wait for 3 or 5 years to house our unhoused neighbors. And then long term is that we've had some great things. We've had Proposition Triple H, we've had the linkage fee and other things, but we've never really talked about the problem, but to Manuel's point, we've got to talk about the solution. We are half a million units short. How are we going to get there? What's the roadmap? What type of money do we need? What type of policies do we need? How do we push a stronger agenda to include all of the Angelenos, those who are immigrant families, those who are Black lives, and those that have just been historically marginalized by all of these systems. Next slide, please. The other thing is, I think all of us on this line want to eradicate homelessness. I think it's a big morsel to swallow whole, but really we do need to continue mortgage relief and rent relief so that those that are temporarily housed stay housed. So what Project Roomkey and Homekey is to make sure that our neighbors that we've temporarily housed don't land back on our streets. And there's been a concerted effort from the local government and the state to do that. And then short term is like, how can we move forward with an agenda that's more equitable? I mentioned the anti-racism motion. The ad hoc report is, you know, it's taken a long time to move forward. It's always easy to talk about the problem, but to come up with an action plan to execute always takes much longer. I'm happy to share that we are moving that forward. There's 67 recommendations, 21 are at the forefront, and a half dozen are already moving or being executed on. So if you want more information about that, you can check with lasa.org. And then long term is that, how do we hold our leaders, policymakers accountable, our systems accountable to actually build what we need to build? And really, we need to start a larger campaign, because the state and the county and the city won't unwind this. We need federal policies that support this and resources to do it. Next slide, please. So transportation, I know LA Thrives loves this, because I remember, you know, how we had all the dialogues and we got the Metro Match Fund. Kudos to everyone on LA Thrives that helped push that agenda, which was about leveraging public dollars and policies to build housing along transit corridors and double density. And really, transportation is key to people's success. You know, essential workers need transportation. We want a more healthier environment, and people need to be close proximity to their jobs and to mass transit. So that's an important piece of that. And we know there have been a number of inequities in these systems for many years. And then I would say that, you know, when we think about homelessness and housing, our unhoused neighbors really struggle with using these systems to move through public spaces, and cities have, you know, managed to make room for automobiles, but we haven't managed to make room for all of our people that need to get around. And we really need to advance some really bold changes related to equity. So there needs to be greater alignment with our systems and our societal goals. And I would say that making room for more high density around transit, like through the great work through Laura has done through TOC and other partners, that is there a way to expand and scale such efforts so we can increase density around jobs and major transportation hubs. I'll stop there. Was I fast? Was I as fast as you, Manuel?
I think we were both, Dave, opening up lots of time, and I'll just end with this last slide because it's kind of beautiful. And
Yes, it is.
It clarifies the various partners, again, UCLA, Luskin, School of Public Affairs, Gary Seguda on that side, the Committee for Greater LA. We should thank Miguel Santana for providing leadership through this, who's the incoming president of Weingart. And of course, the USC Dornsife Equity Research Institute. You may remember that we used to be called the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. We think this is a better name. So we're a little bit like Prince. We're the research center formerly known as, but with a name that in this case you can pronounce. And our tagline is data analysis to power social change. And I can't think of any better example than working with Jacqueline and the committee on this data and this analysis, and with the president of solutions.
You got the problems, I got the solutions. That's awesome.
That's terrific. Thanks so much, Professor Pastora and Jacqueline, for that overview of the report and the recommendations. I want to make sure that people know that Q&A is open and available. I have a few questions ready. I wanted to make sure, though, that I wanted to address Sissy's question. Professor Pastor, back on your slides, you were talking about the shifting share of infections. She was asking whether those were, let me make sure I get the question right. Total share or rate of infections?
It's the total share of infections, which changes more slowly over time. And it seems to have stabilized now with the inequalities that are at the end. It's a very good question. We actually tried to map the daily cases by ethnicity, but there's a lot of noise in that. They were definitely heading up for the Latino community, and it just seemed like this was a cleaner way to present the data that said the same story.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that clarification. I wonder if either of you or both have something to say about what the biggest challenges are to securing support and buy-in from various stakeholders who are necessary to make the report's solutions a reality.
Jacqueline, you first, and then I'll jump in.
Well, I will say that we laid out a groundbreaking report, but there's a lot to digest here. And, we are still somewhat quarantined into our spaces, and it's hard to push a really bold agenda. But I think that what we are doing over the coming weeks, and Manuel can add on here, is prioritizing where we need to drill down on. And where we want to go, and where we want to work with partners like SCAMF to scale up implementation. I think it's brilliant that Miguel had policymakers at the table to push the agenda. But I would say change is hard, and we're talking about equitable solutions. That means that somebody that's been getting a lot will get less. So I think that is one of the biggest things, is adjusting and creating fairness in the system is hard for people to digest, because it might not include them personally, but it's going to be better for all of us if it's more equitable. So I think we need to prioritize, because there's so many things in which we're in the midst of doing that. And all of these things are critically important, because you wouldn't want to say, oh, affordable housing is more than the education of a child who's sitting at home that doesn't have access to the internet. So it's really complex there. But I think really pushing for equity is difficult, and it will be an uphill climb. But I think the door is wide open for deeper dialogues in this space.
So I'll just add to that there were good contacts with the city and the county. And I think, as probably many people find in their experience, they haven't had a lot of time to ground themselves in the data. So presenting the data actually is just kind of useful. And then, people have been busy dealing with emergencies. And so having someone, and I really want to credit both our practitioners like Jacqueline and the Luskin School with really laying out a kind of specific set of policies that people could pursue. Because I think at times the city and the county have been rightfully scrambling. And so I think it helps to have a policy library really available. There's a bigger thing which I think is really important for us to understand as well. And it's the following. Probably most of us who are on this call, when there's an emergency or a crisis, what it brings out in us is the desire to rush to that place, to provide assistance, to think of others. And it is true that in the COVID crisis, there's a tremendous spirit of mutuality and caring and community that's gone on. But we forget that in a crisis, there's also price gougers and vulture capitalists who are coming in to take advantage of people's weakness and to be able to be predatory. And so I think sometimes we also need to think about, for example, the risks that are going to open up in the housing market right now, similar to the risks that happened up in 2008, 2009, with people gobbling up property that folks may not be able to keep the payments up with, including of small landlords who, if their renters aren't paying, aren't able to make their own payments, et cetera. Or the tension that's existed in the state between businesses that want to open rapidly and folks that really want to make sure that they are protecting their workers, et cetera. Look at the struggle that's going on in the county right now about whether or not we should have public health councils at workplaces. That's actually a no-brainer from a mutuality perspective, but it's a problem from a price gouger perspective, because it'll mean that you have to pay attention to what the workers say makes them safe. Now, in fact, there's a big win-win here, because if workers say that they're safe working someplace, then you feel safe going in there. I don't know about you all, but when I go to the grocery stores I go to, the fact that those workers are willing to work there makes me think somebody's protecting their shields and everything, makes me think that I'm sufficiently protected because they're sufficiently protected. So a lot of us have a win-win mentality. We need to make sure that that's broader.
Thanks, Manuel. That's some great concepts. I wonder, Jacqueline, just to give you the opportunity, the issue that you raised about the matter of NOAA, sort of existing buildings that are sort of owned by mom and pops or private sector entities, and sort of pressure put on those owners and those buildings. Wonder, Jacqueline, if you wanted to have the opportunity to kind of expound on that a little bit. I know that you've done some work on that.
Yeah, well, just, doing some self-reflection over the past couple of years. Enterprise has been working to preserve the affordability in small and medium multifamily projects. So that means anything from 49 units and under. And also I see Tom DeSimone is on the phone with Genesis LA, and just been thinking more broadly about strategies to ease access to capital and things of that nature. And at the same period, I sat on the tenant protections working group for the county. And I think that people need to come to terms that tenants need landlords, landlords need tenants. We need to be working together. I think there's a movement to help acquire assets and get them in better hands. That's not going to happen overnight. There's not a whole lot of revenue in these projects, especially when you try to suppress rents. And so it's important that we work with these mom and pop landlords, and who are often sometimes people of color, it's their retirement and other things, is that we work with them to do things to incentivize them to maintain their property in good and healthy condition, and still not crank their rents up. So if we could bring in more resources to subsidize those rents, I think it's incredibly important. So we've been working on acquisitions with nonprofits and hopefully eventually community land trusts in some cases. But I think that it's important that we work with these mom and pop groups as well, because we don't want the fabric of the community to collapse, because if they lose those assets, you make room for corporations like Manuel's mentioned to come in, take over, and they will act like they won't raise the rents. But the only way these projects are feasible is when you crank up the rents. And so looking at strategies to get rental relief to severely rent burdened folks, to see if we can come to some compromise with landlords, and working with the city to absorb whatever coronavirus relief funds they might have to do this is incredibly important. That is coordinated. I know a lot of things are moving fast, but I think this is important focus because not in this data, but some other work that Enterprise did with USC's team when Raphael Bostic was still there, is that most low-income Angelenos live in these smaller buildings, and that affordability is not managed outside of RSO. Like, people don't have Section 8 and other things, and so it's a critical source of preserving affordability.
Really appreciate that, Jacqueline. Thank you so much. Yeah, that question of sort of upstreaming, you know, when somebody can't pay their rent, we've got an immediate crisis, not only for those residents, but it also destabilizes the whole stock of housing,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be NOAA, conventional rent, the stuff that my guys built, you know, rent restricted, covenanted, that's the word I was trying to think of, rent covenanted buildings. You know, the money's got to flow. The solutions include that. So actually taking some questions from the audience, there's one here that says, in addition to policy action, what kinds of culture shifts do we need to ensure that we don't go back to normal? What is the role of advocates who tend to focus mainly on policy?
Well, I'll say a word about that. I'd be interested to see what Jacqueline adds as well. I'll lift up a couple of things. We have a expression, it's like a American or US expression, talk is cheap. And I think we mean that because what we say is, if you're blah, blah, but you don't take action. And I think that's an important point. But talk is not cheap. Talk takes time. Talk is about building relationships, building understanding, building mutuality, learning about each other's issues. And this process was not cheap. It took up a lot of Jacqueline's time, took up a lot more of our time. I mean, it would have been a lot easier for us to start at the beginning, say, well, this is what we're going to do, see you again in 10 weeks, here's a report, and not take the time to learn together, to develop understanding together. And so I think one of the things that's a cultural change has to be the sense of, we call them epistemic communities, knowledge communities, the development of knowledge communities, of shared perspectives, where people can also go back and forth. Because I think Jacqueline could attest, there were certainly moments where there were disagreements about priorities, how much one thing should be lifted up, et cetera, et cetera. The second is, I think, and I hope that this is something I've, done for a while, but I think it became much more pronounced through this process, is what is the role of those of us who are not Black at centering the struggle against anti-Black racism and being among the first in the room to lift up and say it, so it's not our Black colleagues who have to do that work. And then what does that, I have this expression that, and Jacqueline heard me talk about it at one of her dinners, is that it not talking about racism every day is a little bit like not going to the gym every day. If you don't go to the gym every day, and I know we can't right now with COVID, but we can't talk about racism. If you don't go to the gym every day, your muscles become weak, you make mistakes. Nobody wants to help you when you make a mistake because they know you're here in January, but you're not going to stick through July. So they're not part of the conversation with you. If you talk about racism, racial inequality, and the centrality of anti-Black racism every day or whenever you get a chance, what happens is you get better at it, you get stronger at it, and if you make a mistake, your colleagues are going to pick you up and lift you up and call you in versus calling you out. But that comes from showing up for the conversation and showing up to talk about not race, but racism, the structural inequalities that we see.
I mean, I just want to double down on everything you said. You speak my language, Manuel, and I think a couple of years ago when we started the ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness, I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of people, like, why are they doing that? Why are they focusing on that? And it was all based on data, why we needed to do it. And, I had been the lone voice in the room talking about these things for some time, and the fact that it was normalized and that people wanted to say, like, not Jacqueline, you or the committee or what is LASA going to do, but what can I do to help you? And the fact that it was captured in that report as something that we want to see people execute in. That's how you take from, go from talking to walking to executing, and, having a diverse coalition, people that were part of Greater LA Steering Committee, as well as the voices that we weaved in through all the listening sessions. Every week when we talked, we had someone with lived expertise join us to ground us, to keep us aligned with who we're here to serve in our capacity. So just thank you for saying that and trying to normalize the conversation around race. Makes it easier to talk about for people that look like me and you. So I appreciate that.
One thing I want to add is something you just lifted up. If you go and look at the report, and I hope that you do, you'll see that there are lots of stories. So while the speed of a 15-minute presentation, and Alan, I got on, I was like kind of low energy, and Alan was like, are you going to get higher energy for this talk? I hope I got high enough. But if you go to the report, you're going to see that nearly every page has a story, has a quote, has a voice about, because it's one thing to look at that age-adjusted death rate, and it's another thing to read a story about how death came to someone's family and how illness came and the vulnerability people feel, or someone who just got released from prison and is trying to make their way and finds themselves both having to teach their daughter because the teachers can't be there, and avoid cops who's profiling this person even in the middle of a pandemic. So those stories are so important to make the data mean something.
I really appreciate that. There was a question from the crowd. I'm going to do my best to represent it faithfully, but it touches a little bit on the concepts that you both raised about how do we create an environment where not necessarily people of color can step up and make those first statements about what are we going to do about moving towards equity. And so for the question that came in was really about, the report looks at the effects of immigration status and structural racism on the ability for communities of color to thrive. But this question is, and this question is for people who live in communities that are the beneficiary of this structural racism. What are some concepts and ideas about how people from those communities can engage and try to sort of win the hearts and minds of their friends and neighbors, to look for more inclusion, to support housing development, to make sure that housing development is income diversified, really creating opportunities for low-income people to move into higher opportunity areas?
Well, first and foremost, I think COVID is trying to teach us something. It's like a universal lesson right now about mutuality, and the fact that when we don't build, what happens to people who have COVID, what happens to the people that are unsheltered. I mean, homelessness used to just be in Skid Row. It's all over the region. And what happens when we don't take care of groups that are disproportionately impacted for centuries or decades is that they all suffer, and then that suffering spills into their communities via their sidewalk disease and other things. And so I know that you know, a lot of people need to see why they want to do it for themselves, but we should be doing it for mankind. And I know that most people are not altruistic, but I think COVID is trying to teach us something. Homelessness is trying to teach us something, that it's not about you, it's about us. And I think that having that conversation, just as, you know, you see people suffering, they're someone's child too. You know, when you see people on the sidewalk, those people have parents somewhere, and, you know, they have brothers and sisters and other things. And we need to learn how to take greater care of other people. And when you resist housing being built in your community, you're actually exposing that you don't want an inclusive society, that you don't want to move forward with everybody. You actually want to leave people behind. So you have to actually call people on their stuff. That's what I think we need to do, is just call people on it. You can't be like Black Lives Matter, and then next week when they want to build a supportive housing project down the street from you that's well, it's developed, it looks great, it looks better than a Class A property, you got to say yes to those things. So I think that this sector could do a better job of calling people out for their biases and the fact that they talk about inclusion but don't want to execute on it.
I would just add super quickly that I think that is important to do, and also to recognize not everybody's coming along. You have to convince everyone, but you have to convince. There are a lot of people right now grappling with the inequalities of this society and feeling deeply plagued about it. And the number of marchers around Black Lives Matter who are not Black says something, that people are grappling with these issues. I mean, I still remember one younger white business person thinking about Prop 15, for example, and saying to me, I'm having a lot of conversations about racism at the workplace, and I feel like I cannot not support Prop 15, because if I'm trying to tell my Black and brown colleagues that I care about their feelings and their intelligence at work, but I don't want to vote for something that's going to get another $12 billion into the schools for their children, then I must be a hypocrite. So I think kind of that's the kind of people you really want to reach, right? The last thing I'll say is, if that's not enough, one thing we calculate in the report is that if you close the racial income gap in Los Angeles County, it would be another $300 billion a year in annual GDP. That's a lot of money that we are leaving on the floor. Because when you say, people, we don't value your lives, we're not going to make sure you got to successfully educate it, we're going to not deal with the discrimination that in particular affects African-American job seekers, we're not going to deal with the legal status issues that lead us to underpay immigrant Latino workers, et cetera, then you are leaving dollars and GDP and human potential on the floor.
All right. Well, the president of solutions and an energized professor from USC have successfully carried us to the top of the hour. And so it's my unfortunate duty to declare this conversation sort of at the end. But I want to express my appreciation again for Jacqueline and for Professor Pastor for taking your time to work on the report and to spend an hour with us talking about its contents and its recommendations. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to the next time. Everybody continue to be well and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Greenlee. Bye.